Oh, hello and welcome to a debate show without an interesting name. Joining us today we have Dan Fincke, who authors the Pathos blog Camels with Hammers. Sorry, I think that I messed up your name again. And John Figdor, who's a Stanford humanist chaplain, which is kind of cool. And they're going to be debating whether or not morality is subjective or objective. Yeah, I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourselves or anything, or if you guys just want to jump into it.
Well, Dan and I actually know each other, so I'll just say hello again, Dan. It's nice to see your face.
Hi, John.
And
Cool.
to say thank you so much for having us on your show. We're really happy to do this.
I'm really happy to have you guys. This is the first episode of Season 2, so I think it's going to be really fun. Starting off, we have opening statements, which is 7.5 minutes. John is going first, so go get it.
All right. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our resolution for the evening tonight is morality is subjective, not objective, and I will be arguing in support of the resolution. Before we begin our debate, we should start by defining a few terms. Today, we're debating about the difference between objective morality and subjective morality. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines objective as based on facts rather than feelings or opinions. So objective morality is defined as morality based on facts rather than feelings or opinions. Rational Wiki confirms this with its own definition, quote, objective morality is the idea that a certain system of ethics or set of moral judgments is not just true according to a person's subjective opinion, but is factually true. In this view, an act, say tax fraud, is right or wrong as a matter of fact, not based on any person's opinion or perspective about the matter. I take the opposite view in my new book, Atheist Mind, Humanist Heart, Rewriting the Ten Commandments for the 21st Century. And in this book, I argue for the view that ethics is subjective, meaning that ethics is based on people's experiences, preferences, and opinions. Why do we believe that morality is subjective? My first contention is that the idea of objective morality implies that we can step out of our personal experiences, preferences, and opinions and view morality from an objective plane. But we don't have an objective view, which is a view from nowhere. Thomas Nagel, in his 1986 article Freedom and his later 1989 book The View from Nowhere, explores the idea of objectivity and its limits. He argues that, in essence, the idea of objectivity entails an epistemological and metaphysical impossibility. True objectivity, Nagel argues, entails a, quote, view from nowhere, or a view from no one particular perspective. However, this is impossible, since we are all inextricably located within a particular perspective. As a result, morality is intrinsically subjective, since it's based on a person's experiences, opinions, preferences, and culture. It is impossible to step out of our influences, our parents' teachings, our culture, our early moral education, our personal capacities, whether they be intellectual, physical, or empathetic, and make a choice from nowhere. As a result, since we cannot transcend our own perspective and bias cannot be eliminated from the system, objectivity becomes impossible, and the next best possible alternative would be maximal subjectivity. However, it would be a serious error to claim that maximal subjectivity is the same thing as objectivity. It isn't. My second contention is that even if we temporarily ignore the fact that we lack an objective standard from which to view moral facts, a dizzying plurality of explanations of moral facts abound. Thinkers ranging from Immanuel Kant to Jeremy Bentham to John Rawls to Peter Singer to Sam Harris to the entire suite of divine command theologians, as well as liberal theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez and Jim Wallace, have argued their case for their particular conception of objective morality and objective facts. The problem is that different ethical theories tell us to emphasize certain values or to use certain standards in making moral decisions. Utility for utilitarians, fairness for Rawlsians, the commands of God and the teaching of Jesus for theologians, the well-being of conscious creatures for Sam Harris, etc. But the problem is that none of these schools of thought have been successful in convincing each other that they have identified the true root of moral facts, because they're each locating the objective root of moral facts from within their own subjective, experience-informed perspectives. In short, they lack an overarching standard to appeal to. Utilitarians like Bentham think that morality is a matter of greatest number. John Rawls thinks it's individuals' rights and being just and fair. without an overarching standard that can appeal to all and each person can use in its own way, it's impossible to apply this system. Each individual only has access to their own values, and they can only assert that their own value ought to be paramount. Why should we believe them? They're just basing it on their own subjective preference and perspective, not grounding their theories in objective facts. The reason that science gives us objective, albeit tentative, answers to scientific questions, such as how far away is it from Palo Alto to New York City, is because scientists can agree on objective standards for measurements, millimeters, centimeters, meters, kilometers, etc., and on a methodology for how to apply that standard to the world. In morality, there is no agreement whatsoever on either the standard or the way to apply the standard. Kantians, Aristotelians, and utilitarians all propose different standards within each of these philosophies, and there's enormous disagreement within these philosophies on how to apply the standards. My third contention is that Dan's proposed standard of human flourishing, while laudable, is ultimately arbitrary and cannot provide clear moral answers. First of all, when we're talking about human flourishing, we have to ask, who's flourishing? Mine? My friends? My family members? My daughter? Some ISIS fighter in Iraq? And which generation's human flourishing are we talking about? Do we maximize this generation's human flourishing at the cost of future generations? And why are you so focused on human flourishing and not biodiversity flourishing? It seems like an arbitrary choice to privilege human welfare. Why should human welfare be maximized at the cost of massive animal suffering? Dan might have clever answers to some of these questions, but there are literally endless others. Ultimately, different people value different things about life. One person thinks that the good life is a life spent researching cures for diseases for a pharmaceutical corporation. Another thinks that a good life is a life in service of education, serving as a school teacher. A third thinks that the good life is about performing aeronautical research at NASA Ames Research Center. One of these peoples values a short but high-quality life, lived like a candle burning at both ends, while another values a long life and lives an almost ascetic life to maximize his number of years. A third person tries to split the difference and live a moderate life. So the point is, even if you can get people to agree on a standard like human flourishing, which is deeply flawed, there isn't even agreement on how to apply this standard. It's a very vague standard. My final contention is that many interpretations of objective morality bear an absurd consequence that doesn't face the subjective position. If moral facts exist, then by definition they do not depend on the opinions of people or animals. This leads us to the absurd conclusion that since moral facts do not depend on the opinions of people, that moral facts must have existed before humans existed. Technically, even before the first organisms evolved, murder was wrong, arson was wrong, credit card fraud was wrong. Mind you, this is the view that credit card was wrong before credit cards or the human species that gave rise to them came to exist. It's also the view that if the Earth were to be obliterated by an asteroid tomorrow and every person were to die, that insurance fraud would still be immoral, even in a universe with no people and no insurance companies. Now, it's possible to say that you think morality is constrained by time and changes over time, but we have to ask you why you want to constrain your view of moral facts to a particular time period. If moral facts don't depend on the opinions of people, but are anchored in objective fact, then they shouldn't change over time, and they shouldn't be curiously constrained to the time period in which human beings lived. On the other hand, subjective morality is much more easily able to account for the emergence of morality. Our view has it that as organisms evolved, they developed strategies for survival, a view initially propounded by the social contractarian philosophers like Locke and Hobbes, but also who deeply influenced the drafters of our Constitution, but also in the evolution of cooperation research from Dr. Robert Axelrod and Dr. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. Our view has it that morality has emerged as a survival mechanism and would cease to exist if all life were to be destroyed. Morality, in our view, is about the living, about their preferences. Finally, I'd like to close by anticipating one of Dan's arguments. Dan is probably going to suggest that we ought to call morality objective as a strategic move to assuage the fears of Christians and other religious people that atheists lack a coherent moral compass. He thinks, or at least used to think, that Christians will be more likely to think of atheists as good people, or maybe even transition out of theism, if we can assure them that atheists also believe in objective morality. But this has no relevance to today's debate. This is essentially saying even if atheists don't believe in objective morality, we should tell them that we believe in objective morality because it'll make it easier to convince them. Tonight, I'm not interested in rhetoric, but I'm interested in uncovering the truth. Atheists are comfortable exploring uncomfortable truths, such as questioning the thing that gives many people their sense of meaning and value in the world. Because we don't shrink from honestly questioning Christians' beliefs in God, we shouldn't shrink from honestly questioning the nature of morality either. In conclusion, we should reject morality for 4 reasons. 1, morality is subjective because it's about the opinions and preferences of people. By definition, it cannot be objective. Number 2, morality is subjective because there is no agreed-upon standard. Number 3, even if we did have an agreed-upon objective standard, we would disagree on the implementation of the standard. And number 4, subjective morality both better explains the data we have about morality and does not bear the absurd consequence that exists for people who believe in objective morality. For all those reasons, I suggest that you affirm the resolution. Thank you.
Cool.
How long was that?
I'm sorry?
How long did he take?
Oh, he took 10
9
minutes, a little over. I thought we were giving grace because he said final one. 9 minutes, maybe. 9:30-ish.
Okay, I thought we started at 10 o'clock. Okay, so I'll go for...
oh, no, we started a little late.
Okay, so I'll start at... I'll go for 10 minutes.
Cool.
Here.
Feel free to go a little long, don't worry.
Yeah, I was just expecting 7.5. Okay, so let's go here. So, oops, sorry. Okay, so, all right, so let me start out by framing this. The way the definition of objective that's relevant here is, well, there's a couple of them, right? There is this idea of morality existing without persons, is this concept here. There's also the idea of morality existing, or morality being an objective endeavor of inquiry. And I think that the standard that the standard of the view from nowhere, that definition of objective, essentially makes all of our knowledge gone, right? There goes science, because there is no view from nowhere. Scientists always are embodied in a perspective, working in laboratories, working within theories. It's an absurd standard. It's the end of science. It's the end of medicine. That's not objective, because the doctor only can look at you from a point of view, can only look at you from within certain data sets, only certain experiments and experiences in the operating room. That definition of objective, if we went with it, we would have to be just epistemic nihilists across the board. And we'd have to say science isn't real. We'd have to say all of philosophy isn't real. We would have to say John's position about subjective morality isn't real because there's no view from nowhere, and he's making these fact claims about preferences being the basis of morality. And that's just John's subjective opinion then. So if we define objectivity in that ludicrous way, then we wind up saying that there's really no difference between faith and science. It's all just subjectivity, because if you don't have maximal objectivity that could remove all possible disagreement and take an inhuman view from nowhere, then everything is maximally subjective. So that means science, too, is maximally subjective, because any degree of location of the thinker makes it maximally subjective, in John's own words. So that's absurd. And we would want to say that a faith-based opinion that was based only upon hunches and intuitions and preferences and feelings, we say all the time that those opinions are false because they're not objective. But by objective, we don't mean that scientists are accomplishing the view from nowhere. What we mean is that they use rational standards, that they use evidence, that they put together the theories which are most coherent with our experience. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a process of reasoning which is objective in the sense that it is responsive to facts, it is responsive to standards of internal consistency and fit with the world and theoretical power. And those marks, we can do objective morality. There's no reason that we can't. And so the question is that the standard of objectivity here is just inconsistently applied by what John is saying. So what do I think is the basis of moral objectivity? Well, for one thing, I don't think it's merely a strategy. That's a mischaracterization of my position. I don't believe in lying. I don't believe in shirking hard truths. I studied Friedrich Nietzsche, the great defender of the viewpoint of perspectivism, which challenges the whole view from nowhere definition of objectivity. What I'm talking about, and I was a moral nihilist for many years. What I'm talking about is being actually reflective in an honest way about what we actually think and actually do, and not misconveying what we're saying to Christians or to to believers about what atheists actually can say and what we actually do in practice think. And so what I would say is that there's a tremendous amount. The reason I talk about strategy there is because I think there's a tremendous amount of agreement between many objectivists and many of the subjectivists about a lot of the facts about what's going on in morality. But what I'm saying is it is a complete misnomer and misleading and harmful to humanism and harmful to people in general to discount all the objectivity within morality as sheer subjectivity because it involves any degree of reference to human beings. So, for example, if we were so let me just sketch my picture of what objective morality would look like. What I'm saying is this, is that objective goodness, we have an objective term for goodness. The objective meaning of the word good is the sense of effectiveness. If I say that an object is good for accomplishing purpose Y, then what I mean by that is it is effective at that. It's an objective relationship of effectiveness in creating Y. Or if I say that something is a good X, what I'm saying is it functions well at the characteristic activity that characterizes an X. A good heart is one that does what heart things do, what hearts do, which is pump blood through a circulatory system. If you do that well, you have a good heart because of the definition, the sort of functional definition of what hearts are. And this is a scientific way of looking at the world. This is why we can see different organisms with different material hearts made of different designs. We can call them all hearts across species because function is a legitimate one of these categories in nature. It's not designed, it's not given by a god, but functions arise, patterns and forms arise within nature. Human beings flourishing is not purely a subjective matter. We all know what the objective human powers are: reason, emotions, social skills, being able to be sexually fulfilled, being able to be technological, creative, artistic. We all have these abilities. We all understand that they're excellent powers we have, and you'd have to pretend you don't know that to say that's merely subjective. These are objective abilities we have, and in realizing them, we realize ourselves. We come into being more. And so we have an intrinsic interest in being because we are these beings. And so it's inherently irrational as the beings we are, given every one of our purposes, to be at odds with the conditions of our own thriving. And so where morality comes into this is the systems of cooperation that are involved in order to figure out the best means for us all to flourish. Now, which of our abilities to thrive in? Sure, that allows for some subjectivity in the sense that if you have a choice between two equally good opportunities, you can make a subjective choice. But that's not a total subjectivity, because there's still better and worse between, say, destroying one of your abilities capriciously or gratuitously without any need, versus developing an ability without any loss to any of your other abilities. It's clear in those sorts of circumstances that more abilities is better than less. More fulfillment of our powers is better than less. Why should we care about morality? Well, this is very basic, is that as the kinds of beings we are, when we flourish, it involves a coordination among people. It involves other people as the preconditions of our minimal well-being and of our maximal thriving. Also, our powers are the kinds that they are maximally powerful when they spread into others, and I'll explain what I mean by that later. But what I mean by that in raw terms is that most of our abilities are most fulfilled when they create further functioning beyond ourselves. You know, you can pretend that that's merely a preference, but it's a preference that is universally shared. How people want to realize that, how they want to make trade-offs within goods, doesn't mean there are no goods. Medicine is an objective science. Medicine doesn't exist without humans. So is medicine maximally subjective because there wouldn't be any truths about human medicine were there no humans? Is it not true that performing a bypass will fix a heart attack? Is that not true because it wasn't true before there were organisms? Because it won't be true after an asteroid? To answer really briefly the question of what it means for these objective truths about what will lead to our flourishing, our thriving together, obviously this involves complicated calculations. But it's a mistake to say that Singer's basing his ideas on experiences different than Kant's, and that's why the moral philosophers disagree. They don't make appeals to, I just happen to have this kind of experience in my life. What they do is they give reasons. They're all working within a shared set of basic values: formal consistency in action, maximizing pleasure, realizing human potential, or that of persons generally, minimizing suffering, or that of sentient beings generally. Those sorts of values are shared. The disagreements are only in how to theorize about them. But in a random circumstance in which these sorts of values are not in conflict, there is no sort of great mystery and subjectivity involved. We all reason objectively constantly. So finally, really quickly, what I'm going to argue later on as we go here about this idea of morality without persons is that the truths about human nature are truths, even though they all came about after we evolved. Evolution itself didn't exist before there were the first organisms, or biological evolution didn't exist before there were the first organisms. So is evolution completely subjective because at the Big Bang there was no evolution, therefore it cannot be a real thing? Even though, because after biological life is destroyed, there could be no evolution, so evolution is not real. What we're talking about in objective morality has nothing to do with what life will be like after the asteroid hits. What we're talking about is the most efficient, objective ways, rational ways to coordinate our lives for our maximal objective flourishing. And in that context, the objective morality is whatever accomplishes that maximal good, and that could be formally thought about even where there are no humans. We could right now make a movie about imaginary aliens in imaginary places and imaginary dilemmas based on their imaginary abilities, and we could say, formally speaking, yeah, that's the right answer morally in terms of the abstract relationships. Mathematical truths are like this. There is no, you don't need to wait until there's a Google number of fans to make a comment about how many Google of fans minus one would be. You don't need these actual entities to exist for the formal relations they're about to exist. So if you can specify what a human would be, if you could specify all the circumstances we live in, then you could specify for the different cultural contexts or different specific situations what would be the most objectively best course of action for our thriving if you knew enough facts. And that is objective enough for me, even without us actually, or even before or after we existed, the same way mathematical truths, and the same way scientific truths don't depend upon being actualized at any given moment to be objective. Okay, I'm done.
Cool. So now we are moving on to the rebuttal section of our whole deal. John?
So yeah, I guess I'll begin with talking about Matt's case. Sorry, not Matt, Dan's case, and then I will move back into my case and talk about some points I think are really important to pull through. But just for starters, off the top, Dan really said something at the end of his comments that made me think. He said, "It's objective enough for me." And I want to say that's a very curious statement to make. I think we need to fall back to this definitions question. So for today's debate, I proposed a very simple definition for objective morality. This is a dictionary definition. This is the definition that's used in Rational Wiki. This is a standard debate definition. This is very easy to understand where this comes from. The words mean exactly what the words mean. The word objective in logic means it's not dependent on someone's opinion. It's just purely factually true. That's the meaning of it in mathematics. That's the meaning of it in a number of other fields. So I really think that's why we should stick with this definition. Dan also then says, John, that would imply that science is purely subjective. That if we followed your definition of science, we have to say it's subjective. And I say, no, the reason that it's not subjective, Dan, is what I discussed in my case. It's because scientists can actually agree upon objective measures, upon standards to use. So when they're measuring something, they can agree, we're using the inch measurement, and an inch is defined as X, and this is how you perform the task of measurement. That's why even though there isn't one correct answer here, we can actually come to the best possible answer. And this is because we're able to agree on a standard. What Dan didn't do in any of his discussion is really propose a standard other than this vague concept of human flourishing, which I'll talk about much later in his case. Then Dan didn't really signpost throughout his case, so I don't really know what his major arguments are. I guess I'll go through some points that he made. When he said objective means responsive to facts, I really think that he's trying to pull a definition just out of his personal convenience, and that we ought to use the commonsensical definition that I proposed before. When he says that good relates to effectiveness, that's fine. I don't really see how this is relevant. His idea that human flourishing is a universal value is a very interesting point here. I think it's clear to say that everyone wants to flourish, but no one agrees on what flourishing would look like. So in one culture, the idea of the ideal life is a life spent in academic study. In another, the ideal life is a life spent defending people. A lot of people lionize police officers and firefighters because they run in to defend people. It's not clear to me that one of these views of human flourishing is obviously correct and the other one is wrong. There's no agreement on human flourishing here. We can see this in the enormous disparate cultures we have around the world. So I don't think it's a very good to base our definition here on human flourishing. I mean, even the ISIS fighters in Iraq and Afghanistan, they think that they're flourishing. I mean, I disagree, and I think Dan would too, but from their perspective, they are. That's why this definition of human flourishing is so weak. It doesn't have any meat on it. It doesn't have any way for us to say, well, yeah, I mean, the rational person who's talking about, they want to flourish by studying medicine or studying the arts, like that makes sense. But someone else who wants to study flourishing by, blowing up bus bombs, that makes no sense. Unfortunately, if they can account for it within their system of value, that's their definition of human flourishing, and it's very hard to argue someone out of that. Then he makes this interesting point about medicine being an objective science, which is really interesting. Medicine actually is at the intersection of science and practicality. One of the problems here is that, so take the idea of medicine. If we have a 75-year-old man who injures a leg or has something happen, our treatment options are going to be wildly different than they might be for a younger person. For an older person who develops a disease, if the treatment procedure is extremely painful and might debilitate the final days of life that they have, a lot of people would choose quality of life over quantity of life. So even in medicine, there's no universal objective standard here. Everyone has their own preferences about how they want their health to be. One person might say the ideal healthy life is a life where you work out every single day and you're in tip-top physical condition, you go jogging every day. Another person might say, my definition of health is not having any active diseases and not being in pain. There isn't a consensus on what the definition of health is. This is why when doctors ask patients what they want to happen, they don't just wheel out a computer and the computer tells them, you will have X procedure. It's because we realize that people's preferences matter, and what people want is that ultimately going to inform medical practice, just as much as the science. So we even see this in cases where people develop prostate cancer, and a lot of men say they don't want to have the surgery for prostate cancer because they're concerned about sexual performance things. There's so many different factors that feed into health that even in health, which Dan thinks is a clear-cut example of objective morality, it's just a simple science, it's not. It's so dependent on people's opinions and preferences and their culture. And so let's be frank, medicine here is not a very good example for Dan's case. Then let's go back through my case.
That's 5 minutes.
Oh.
Right?
Yep. That's 5 minutes.
We're going to stick to the time.
Go
All
ahead,
right.
Dan.
Okay, so really quickly here, when I said objective enough for me, he says, well, it has to be independent of opinion. But then he switched the standard, right? So morality is not going to be human specification of a standard of what we're looking for, what we want morality to kind of practice it to be, because that would involve a human and being involved in specifying the meaning of the term. But then the standard for scientists is scientists can agree on these standards. Well, is it just their subjective agreement? What I'm saying is this: scientists know that, like what the goals of science are. They're intrinsic to science. Those are the goals of of creating predictive and fruitful explanatory frameworks of the world, which have theoretical scope. What I'm saying is that the practice of morality is a practice of living. When people ask, is there a moral reason to do this or a moral reason not, it's related to the purposes of living. It is related to what is actually going to be good or bad, harmful or not, harmful or beneficial to humans. And in those situations, people do know the basics of flourishing. Even though it involves a lot of situational judgments, engineering involves situational judgments, medicine involves situational judgments. Taking into account different factors is not subjectivity. It is objectively looking at the factors of a particular circumstance. And what I'm saying is that objective morality is the kind of morality where when people tell each other, you must do this or you must not do that, there are good reasons that go back to the basic categories of fairness, harm, avoidance, etc. Even in science, there's not one method of doing science. The methods are variable to what will produce the results. A physicist applies certain tools. Biologists apply different tools. The fact that the tools vary, the fact that different circumstances need to be treated with scientific judgment and in order to create these comprehensive theories that work, doesn't mean it's radically subjective. And neither does morality just because we have to take into account variables, like what will be good for this person given their physical constitution, given their natural aptitudes, given these various things. And by the way, morality doesn't have to tell us how, like what exactly we should choose between two equal goods, any more than medicine is radically subjective because two treatments could do an equal job and one prefers the one and one prefers the other. The objectivity is in establishing, ruling out a whole number of things as not preferable. And not just preferable in the sense of not desired, but objectively bad for us, objectively harmful for us. And finally, he's conflating here this difference between a patient not wanting to live longer because it would be painful versus taking a treatment. But what I was talking about with medicine is that the doctors can at least specify these are the better courses of action for this result, these are the better for that result. Whether or not a subjective preference comes in choosing between two commensurable goods, that doesn't eradicate the objectivity of medicine. It doesn't mean doctors are just going on hunches and feelings and intuitions. It means that there's a choice involved, and it's a practical choice. And yes, sometimes there are goods which are equal, but that doesn't mean that it's subjective. It just means you have relatively equal goods, and you may as well flip a coin. At that point, yeah, one is as good as the other. Take either one. That doesn't mean that there's no objectivity, that no courses of action can be ruled out. And this idea that if you want to say that ISIS, you can't argue with ISIS, then what you're basically abdicating is the ability to tell ISIS they're immoral. And if you think atheism is going to, that's just a hard truth, that there's just nothing we can say to ISIS because their opinion. Well, ISIS doesn't believe in evolution either. So should we just say, well, they just think that? What you do in those cases is you appeal to common things. Just as we have a common shared view, access to the world, and we can argue about evolution, so we have common shared goals with everyone, including ISIS, in terms of flourishing as human beings, and we can point out the ways that their methods don't actually work to actually make people flourish. And it doesn't matter if they think they do. That just begs the question that their preferences are automatically right. You're begging the question. You're not proving anything. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, cool. Our next section, for the next 7 minutes, John is going to control the question, and you're going to question Dan, and then the answer should be about 1 minute in length, and then or less, and then Dan is going to question John. So,
sure. I'm not going to need my whole 7 minutes either. We'll keep this nice and brief.
Okay.
It seems so far that the debate is actually pretty clearly defined. So my first question for Dan is, look, if you want to make moral decisions, you have to provide a standard that we're going to use to adjudicate these decisions. What is your standard, and can you apply it in a coherent example in case of, say, like how the standard applies to late-term abortion? Like, what's the objective answer about whether late-term abortion is good or bad?
Well, I'm not going. That's like saying that a scientist can't have an answer unless they can give us in 1 minute a full account. I mean, I can't. That's not the point. The point.
We have 6 minutes, so go ahead.
Okay, no, we only have 7 minutes. You're supposed to ask me a number of questions. But anyway, but I can do that. But the point here is this. The point is that the basic goods we're dealing with rule out many courses of action, okay?
The basic goods we're dealing with. But the problem is that you have different goods than the ISIS fighter does.
It doesn't, no,
like,
okay,
the ISIS fighter, his primary goods are things like purity, things like following God's laws, things like praying every day. Those are his values. That's what he thinks is most important.
Hey guys,
and his reasons for it is his holy book tells him that.
John,
now, how would you argue with that person?
Okay, how would I argue? What I'm telling you is you're begging the question when you say there's no way to argue with him just because he has a preference. What I can say is
I'm not saying there's no way to argue it. I'm saying it's subjective.
Hey, John, don't interrupt him, okay?
I'm sorry, I thought we controlled the time. Go ahead.
Okay, listen, John, the issue is this. He also believes, because of the Holy Book and a whole number of other propositions about facts about the world. So are those all, is it only subjective to tell him, well, I don't believe in God, so therefore every argument made to him is subjective? If the fact that there is no God rules out all the propositions about fact that are based on that, then they would also automatically rule out any claim he makes about morality based on that. The same reasons to not believe in God are the same reasons that God can't ground morality. So there's no need to say, well, he just believes in God. I can only subjectively argue with him. Well, if you can argue objectively against the existence of God, then you have an objective reason for him not to base his morality on God. And then
so we might agree on the God thing. I think God might actually be it's not consistent as an idea. So I think I might agree with you on that. Okay. But it still doesn't solve this problem of the standard. The reason that medicine is a science and is not just a subjective art form is because scientists, doctors can agree on certain standards, right? They can agree on these measures. But there's a secondary problem, Dan, which is that in order to know what to do in this circumstance, the doctor also has to integrate knowledge about what the patient wants. There isn't just a correct answer about what to do whenever a patient has a heart attack. The answer is, does the patient value long-term life? Do they value short-term life? Do they value a life of pain? Are they willing to sacrifice? So how would you respond to that?
What I'm saying is that the fact that they're... Okay, so let me back up 1 second. So back to the ISIS question, the point is, once we rule out, like you said, there's an internal consistency in the idea of God. Well, my point is that human beings have objectively the same basic interests in flourishing in our abilities and also in our powers. Those interests are objective. It is a practical art to be involved in morality, and you can prove to some people that, look, by objective metrics, this method of accomplishing our shared goals and your own deeper desire, your desire for meaning or your desire for all these various things, won't actually work. You know, if you think that following the Quran will lead to the most flourishing society, you're wrong in the modern world. It is not going to do that. And so the point is, those are objective sorts of things. Now, to get to the medicine
How
question,
would you tell them they're wrong?
Well, again, by objective measures, if what you show people is that empowering women objectively leads to economic growth, then a country that is suppressing those abilities is objectively stifling women in their objective powers. Someone says a woman is only made to serve a man. That's false. Otherwise, why would she have all these other abilities besides just serving a man or raising children? In other words, the abilities are there. If someone has all these abilities they can thrive in, and they would excel in them, they would take pleasure in them, they would be a fuller realization of their very being. That is an objective matter. If someone says, no, none of that matters, stifle all that because you happen to have a vagina, they're not being objective. They don't have an equal opinion to someone who says, It's objectively better for someone to develop more of their powers if they can than to be arbitrarily stifled based on their gender. That's objective. It's not just my feeling preference versus his. It's unfair, too. I mean, the other thing is formal standards.
Sorry, why is it objective? Because you're saying it's objective because it's rational? No, that's objective according to the standard that you have invented as the definition of, which I'm rejecting. I'm not interested in debating whether it's objective enough for you, Dan.
John, objectively speaking, it is better for humans to have working hearts. It's just better. Because otherwise there's no humans. It's an objective.
What does that even mean, Dan? How could it be objective? It's only objective because people want to stay alive.
No, I'm saying for there to be humans, objectively hearts need to be functioning. That's it. They don't function. That's not a subjective preference. It's not like humans can say, oh, I want to be one of the humans without a heart. That's not a preference choice. It's an objective precondition of your very being. And what I'm saying is that when you have other powers that constitute being a human, you can only exist through your reason, your emotions, your sociability. You don't even exist as a being without these things. So to harm them is to objectively harm yourself. Now, if you want to, if you have a preference for that, that doesn't make it right. It makes it still an objective loss of your powers through which you were instantiated.
Yeah, sorry. So this definition of objective is absolutely all over the place.
Let's
get into this a little bit more. So, Dan, sorry, am I controlling the time, or what's going on here?
Stop interrupting, John.
Components to it. Well, I mean, I'll let him ask a question next, but I'm going to ask him questions in a moment. He can argue for his position.
Yeah,
if you make a claim, you make the claim that I'm all over the map. What I'm saying is there's a difference between our objective flourishing, which is our maximization of our powers, and then there are methods of rationally and objectively looking for what will do that. You know, in other words, looking.
Sure, Dan. This objective definition of flourishing. Do people agree everywhere on what is human flourishing?
Do people agree everywhere on whether evolution is true?
That's super not important, and I thought I was asking that question.
It's very important. It's very important because truth doesn't depend on what all people agree on. It doesn't depend upon the untutored, judgments of people who've been taught by theologians to think it comes from God. So if most people don't have a good moral philosophy, most people don't have a good account of engineering. Most people don't have a good account of physics. Most people don't have a good account of medicine. Most people can't tell you most things that are true. What I'm asking is, what is the argument? What is the best argument for what is objectively good? And if you're just appealing to the fact that people disagree, well, then all disputes are over because people happen to disagree. But everybody knows murder is wrong. Everybody knows don't chop off your limbs for no good reason. Everybody knows this stuff. It's very obvious. Everybody knows those basic things. It's just how we then develop the hard moral questions. That takes applying very difficult standards to very sensitive.
So I can't even hear Dan right now. Can anyone else hear him?
Yeah, I can hear him.
Yeah.
Okay, so... But let me jump in here because I'm feeling pretty filibustered at this point.
Well, it's your turn to talk. I'm going to ask you questions now. You can talk. Okay? So,
okay, great. So, like I said before, you keep pushing on this standard of human flourishing. My point is that there are enormous differences people have in what constitutes human flourishing. These differences are not just...
It doesn't make them right. I'm saying
Dan, you have to let him talk. It's a back and forth.
Okay, I thought I was supposed to ask him questions next.
Well, let him finish his thing, and you can ask him questions. Are you done with your thing?
I mean, look, so this is real. I'm going to ask 2 more questions because this has been silly. I don't understand how this time period is supposed to work.
I'm sorry.
Let's just get the answers to these 2 questions, and then I'm done, okay? So my first question is, there is a standard, Dan. You proposed the standard of human flourishing. Cultures all over the world deeply disagree about this to the extent that which these values are not they're not comparable in a way.
No, they don't.
Explain to me how we can have laws in the U.S. that are so enormously different from laws in Confucian societies that have things like grandparents. It's illegal to neglect your grandparents. You have a legal obligation to care for your ailing grandparents. Why is it that we have that value in Confucian societies, but we don't have that value in our society?
Why is it that in certain countries they believe in evolution and in others they don't? In other words, the fact that there's...
Because of bad teaching. But can you answer my question now?
Good. Yes, so what I'm saying, though, is that the fact of disagreement is proof of nothing. What you have to say is this. There's two ways to approach that issue. One is, it doesn't matter the methods that human beings are using to realize these objective goods. The point is that the same basic goods of thriving in our abilities, thriving socially, thriving emotionally, thriving rationally, those goods are shared. What's different is two things. One, different material conditions that lead to cultures developing different opinions, but that doesn't mean every opinion is right. If certain practices are harming in a culture's ability to flourish, they could be objectively wrong, and that could be shown in objective metrics that that culture needs to change things. No culture wants to suffer. Now, cultures will be irrationally attached to the way they've always done things, even if they need to improve, but that has nothing to do with what's objective. When we sit down and say, what should we do, we don't just ask, well, what does our culture do? We ask, what would best accomplish these flourishing in all these metrics. The second thing is that sometimes the conditions in different cultures.
Can I ask a second question today, or
let's?
Look, you can't ask questions and then not have any room
But Dan,
to answer.
look, I love you, man. You're a philosophy professor, though. You're speaking for like 10 minutes to each question.
I am answering the questions.
Okay, great.
Let him answer the questions, but
It's
also
my turn to ask you questions.
it is his turn to ask you questions.
It's supposed to be that he was supposed to ask me questions and give me a minute.
I allowed John to go a little bit over because there was some interruption and some back and forth, but I'll give you the same amount of time, which is 10 minutes.
Ask me questions, and then I was supposed to answer for a minute. Ask a question, I answer for a minute. I can't get 30 seconds into an answer without him interrupting me.
Okay. Yes, there was a lot of interrupting. Now it is your time.
Yeah, you can't cut me off halfway through an answer. That's
okay.
impolite.
Finish your answer, and then we'll move on to your turn.
Oh, I'm done. I've answered. I'll ask him questions.
Okay, so then
ask him some questions.
So what you're saying,
John,
John,
save your other question for later because we're going to have another section for you to do it in. I would like
you have a non-subjective reason. So are you saying that it's merely a matter of subjectivity that the Holocaust was wrong?
No. Sorry, what was the question? That the Holocaust was
really
wrong?
A matter of
it's a matter of subjectivity that the people who were killed in the Holocaust did not want to be killed, and that's what made it wrong.
Okay, no. It made it wrong, or is that just your subjective feeling that it was wrong? But it still wasn't really wrong because to Hitler it was right, and so it was also right. Was it right? Because
there's no wrong and really wrong. There's just right and wrong. And in this case, I think the Holocaust was subjectively wrong. In the case that I think if any rational person. Oh, go ahead.
To whom? Oh, okay.
To what?
To whom? Which subject thought it was wrong?
The people who were killed, Dan, the victims.
Okay.
That's what.
And Hitler thought it was right, so it's equally wrong and equally right, because the Nazis thought it was right and the Jews thought it was wrong, and it's purely subjective?
No, Dan, I'm not a crude relativist. I don't think that just because there are multiple opinions, all opinions are equally good. I think that some opinions are better than worse, and we can use standards such as. Can I finish my answer? Okay. We can use standards such as reason and logic and appeals to
reason and logic don't apply. You said if reason and logic apply, it's objective. You said
no, I did not say that if reason and logic apply, it's objective. That's your definition that you introduced, and that I don't agree.
You gave a definition that said objective means logical.
Here's how this works. Dan asks questions, and then John answers them, and then Dan, you can follow that up. But I feel like you guys are interrupting each other a lot, and that's not cool. So
there's an inconsistency here when you said that the standard is objective if it's subject to facts and logic, and then I ask you whether or not Hitler's opinion is equal to the Holocaust victims, and you say it's subjective, but logical to have the subjective view. So is it a correct opinion that it was wrong to have the Holocaust? And if it's correct, isn't that an objectively right answer?
So I never said that. What my definition of objective morality is morality based not on the opinions and preferences of individuals, but on pure fact. And you've not shown us any facts yet. You've just shown us people's opinions and preferences.
I did not. I showed you facts of human flourishing. What it is for us to be is objective. That's facts.
Dan, you might think you've shown facts. You might think you've shown facts, but you can't explain the wild disagreements between people about these facts. What about a person who's asking you, Dan, they come to you advice and they say, I'm choosing either to be a philosophy professor or an EMT surgeon who's going to work in Africa. How do you give them advice on what to do?
That's not a moral question. I can give them
it's not?
Well, of course. Well, what you can do is you can do something. I mean, you can answer that. You can tackle it objectively in terms of what are your abilities, what will make you most happy. But those are objective answers about what will make you most happy. It was objective answer about what your abilities are that you will thrive in. Those are objective, even if they involve a reference to your subjective facts. You know, the fact that your psychological pleasure states are objective facts. What will make you thrive in your abilities, more or less, what will make you more pleased or less, are objective facts. They're not references to your, to what you think will make you happiest. It's actually an objective answer what will make you happiest. But whether or not to be an EMT or philosopher is not a moral question in the deep sense, because there's no conflict there. There's no rights of one person against another. No harm involved. Both are good life choices.
A utilitarian might say.
Maybe. I'm not a utilitarian. I mean, what I'm saying is maximize your abilities. So figure out what your maximal thriving would be. Is it as a philosopher? Is it an EMT? But that's subjectively determinable based on your abilities and your actual pleasure states. That's objective, though. Morality is what objectively creates those things. Does that make sense?
Not entirely. So this question seems to me to be a very moral question. If what I should do with the rest of my life is not a moral question, then I'm not sure that there are any moral questions. I think it makes sense as a question to ask, well, let's just say that right now this person has equal skill sets in philosophy and EMT work. They have a real interest in both of these things. What would you say to them? Is there one right answer, or is the answer, well, what do you prefer doing? I mean, they're both laudable careers. What's more interesting to you? And if that's the answer, isn't that a subjective view?
No, what I'm saying is no, it's not, because the question of morality is not these commensurable. What you do is you give cases where there are two equal goods, and you know they're both good things. You didn't ask me, what would you say to an axe murderer or a surgeon? Which you do. I mean, what you're doing is you're taking two good things that are commensurably equal, and so since there's not a one right answer in that case, then you want to say there's no such thing as genocide being wrong, slavery being wrong, rape being wrong.
Whoa,
just because two things can be right doesn't mean nothing can be wrong. It just doesn't logically follow.
I never said that genocide is right or any of these other things. I think they're wrong from a subjective perspective, which is all we have.
But not objectively wrong. They're not objectively wrong from other people's subjective perspectives. They're right, correct?
No, that's not what this means.
Oh, so they're not objective. They're not correct from anyone's subjective position.
Dan, the view that different people have subjective opinions doesn't commit me to the view that one of these people is necessarily right every time and one is wrong. It also doesn't commit me to the view that there's only one correct answer. There could be 3 or 4 correct answers for some of these
that's what I said, but that's not subjective. That just means
how is that?
There's objectively equal answers. That's all. That's like saying that there's no objectivity in health, because sometimes you can eat green beans or peas and they're equally good. So there's no objective health advice. Well, no, there's objective health advice because when it's not equal, there's objective measures to assess it. And that's all I'm saying objective has to be.
Here's what I would say with the medical example. I would say that with health effects, you can say, look, if you give the doctor what your goal is, the doctor can give you the objective best way to pursue that goal, but they can't give you the actual goal itself. You have to say, my goal is to avoid pain, or my goal is to repair this condition, or my goal is to whatever it happens to be. And then given that goal, the doctor is able to give you an objective answer on what will give you the best way to get to that goal. What they can't do is give you the goal itself. That has to be imported from outside.
It's not imported from outside human nature, though. You can't just pick any goal.
Human nature?
Yes. Your goal can't be just pick, I want to be a skunk, right? In other words, the goals are going to be related to pleasure, related to thriving in your abilities. There's a circumscribed set of abilities we have, of pleasures. What it is to objectively thrive as a human is not this vague mystery. We all know the things that are objectively good for us. The question then is, among those good things, sometimes it's a wash, or sometimes you have to choose between two evils, and in those cases you have to make a subjective call because it's either way, they're equal. But objectivity is about those cases where it's not just anything, one course of action is going to be significantly objectively better for you as the being you are, with your abilities, more pleasure, more thriving in your abilities. That's objectively determinable on a factual basis.
Was that a question?
Yeah, okay, so let me ask him a question. So the question then is, if you're saying that there's a subjective internal consistency standard that can then reconcile the preferences, is that what you're saying? And if so, if that standard is rationality, which you said that it's not rational to commit the Holocaust, then the question is, how is the more rational answer not an objectively better one?
So I think consistency is a good norm to follow for this, and I agree with you. That's a worthwhile thing. I think the problem here is that we're not going to agree on what all of these constituents of the moral view are, right? Like, your standard is just too vague here, Dan. I think the problem is that there's too much room to interpret this thing. Like, when you give this idea of human flourishing, look, I know that you say that I'm giving you cases that are hugely undetermined, but that's where the problem cases are. If it was all what's more reasonable, murder or not being murdered, well, that's a pretty easy case because our intuitions lead us pretty clearly in one direction. But what I'm saying is that subjective answers are better in this sense, because even when we acknowledge that our answers are coming from a specific perspective, that doesn't mean that we can't have rational argument. We're not saying that every view is equally good. We're saying that some views are better than others, and those views are going to be based on things like, do they actually relate to the science? Someone who says that they've got a good idea, but it doesn't relate to science at all, is not useful.
Okay, no, not just not useful, it's objectively bad. And the point here is this: when you say
it's not real.
But now there's two things. One is, I'm not saying that I can't deal with those cases. What I'm saying is I'm not going to trivialize by saying, oh, here's a 1-minute answer. We're talking on the theoretical level. What I'm saying is that the ability to generate answers means when we dialogue, there are standards of what are good and bad arguments here. You can't just pull anything out as equal. If someone says, well, I just like killing people, it's not as good an answer. It's not a good argument. And what I'm saying is that there's a multitude of factors we have to bring to bear, but when we balance the factors, the ultimate question is what leads to the maximal thriving of the most people, taking care of the worst off. Why? Because it's only fair to opt in. You know, people would have a rational disincentive to opt in if it wasn't fair to them, if they weren't thriving in a system. So but ultimately the precondition of the debate is that we believe there are better and worse answers. That word better is an objective word. And if all you meant by better was what I, Jonathan Figdor mean, but prefer, then that's subjectivity. But if by better you mean more for human flourishing, more for pleasure, more for consistency, then those are objective standards that everyone should adopt, right?
Cool.
I'll let John get a word in.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was?
John, you want to give a close because we're out of time?
Yeah. Why don't we wrap this up?
Okay. Why don't you just wrap? I'm done. Whenever you're done.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Dan for a really thoughtful debate, and thank you to Atheist Analysis for having us on to do this. It's important for us atheists to have these conversations because at least when I'm arguing with Dan, I know I'm talking with a fundamentally rational person, which is a really nice thing to do. Now, going through the case, I don't think this has been Dan's finest hour. I think there are a couple problems here. Let's begin with the question of the definition here. At the beginning of the case, I proposed a very easy-to-understand definition for objective morality. This is a dictionary definition. This is a commonsensical definition. This is the definition that we use in philosophy, as I gave the example with this Thomas Nagel piece. This is the standard definition in the field. If Dan wants to use this additional definition of something is objective as long as it's not purely based on human opinion, as long as there's some science in there. There don't seem to be any good reasons to adopt this standard. It just seems jury-rigged specifically for his case. I mean, it seems like if Dan doesn't get his very definition, he loses the case. Whereas to me, I can go either way. But on my definition, which seems more logical, my case is clearly better. Then let's move through Dan's actual case. He proposes the standard of human flourishing as a universal value, and he says that we find humans who want to flourish in every society around the world. This is a great point, except Dan hasn't answered my numerous questions about what this standard actually is. What are the constituents of human flourishing? He says there's agreement, but there's actually enormous difference in different cultures about what's considered a good life, what's considered a valuable life. Then his next point here is that, and then in bolstering this, he tries to refer to medicine as his example, and he says, look, medicine is an objective science. But I showed him through my argument that actually medicine is not an objective science. Medicine gets you to the answer. It is the fastest way to find out what the best thing to do is. But you have to give it the goal. The problem is medicine doesn't have a built-in goal. The goal had to be imported from outside of medicine. Once we said, well, the thing that we want to maximize is health, and then we further said, well, the thing that I want to maximize is my quality of life, or my longevity of life, then science and medicine can help you determine how best to accomplish that, but what it cannot do is give you that goal in the first place. Now let's move back through my case. So we had a quibble about the definition. We've already discussed that. My second contention was that morality is subjective because there is no agreed upon standard. Dan, throughout the argument, never was able to explain how this standard can be fixed culture to culture, never is actually able to explain how this standard could be implied to different cultures. It just doesn't work. My third argument is that even if Dan had a standard, and let's take his standard of human flourishing, he can't apply the standard in a rational and reasonable and consistent way because people have different preferences about how this standard will be implicated. So the problem here is that even if we say we want human flourishing as the standard, the problem then is, well, who's human flourishing? Is it my family? Is it my friends? Is it my enemies? Is it and why is it just people? It seems awfully anthropocentric to just say, well, morality only relates to human beings. They're the only thinking things. It just isn't consistent there. Then my fourth argument was that subjective morality lacks the absurd implications of objective morality, which is this idea that if the earth were to be obliterated and all human beings cease to exist, that, like insurance fraud would still be immoral. It just doesn't make sense. The morality relates to the views of actual creatures and actual people with preferences. That's what we're talking about. If there's no people, then there's no morality because it doesn't affect anyone anymore. So for all these reasons, I ask you to affirm the resolution.
Okay, so in closing here, John tells me that on my view of objective flourishing, we can't apply rationally and consistently. But magically, if we say subjectivity, suddenly there's internal standards of rationality. So for me, I can't say that objective flourishing gives any kind of criteria for saying that one person's preferences are actually better or worse. But so he says, because who's flourishing, right? Mine or Dan's or John's or the ISIS. But then as soon as I say to John, so then subjectively, why should we prefer, the Jews' opinions to the Nazis? And suddenly, it's just more rational, but not objective, more rational, out of nowhere, to prefer the Jews' opinion over the Nazis. So this is complete inconsistency. I can't argue with any rational consistency because all I'm doing is appealing to the shared objective ability through which human beings thrive, the shared pleasures we're all seeking, the shared standards of formal consistency, which are only rational to uphold since we're all in this together. And so it's rationally and formally inconsistent not to do so. These standards are no way objective because there's not a goal given. But I say there is a goal given by our very nature. Our nature as human beings is a set of powers. Objectively, the same way the heart can either thrive or not, by whether or not it can pump blood or not. The eyes can thrive or not by whether they can see or not. Well, similarly, the human can thrive by whether or not they flourish in our reason, our emotions, our social abilities, our technical capacities, our artistry, our objectively observable factual abilities. And every one of the examples that you give for subjectivity boil down to choices among those objective goods, but never an argument that they're not basic objective goods in the first place. Nobody denies those are objective goods. They're universally understood as factually good. All of them are preferable to not. It would be irrational to prefer to not have them. The only problem is we're people with finite resources, with limited abilities, and limited time in different cultures. So because of that, different cultures and different individuals have to make trade-offs. But that doesn't mean any trade-off is as good as any other. Ones that have a net loss to overall flourishing, those that are unfair to others, who are, it's a formal inconsistency. Those that are painful, these things can be objectively determined. What actually helps us maximize our abilities or not, what leads to pleasure or not, what is actually formally consistently fair or not. These are objective metrics. They have to be applied situationally, but they're objective reasoning. And so the last thing about that is that it's fine that different cultures could come up with comparably equal goods in different ways. That could happen. But that doesn't mean every solution a culture comes up with is equally good to any others. Not just because they happen to say that they think that's as good. It can be objectively on their own deeper objective abilities standard that they're either thriving or they're not. And so John knows this. As soon as you actually ask him for a moral judgment, he appeals to rational consistency. But I'm not allowed to for some mysterious reason. Okay.
Cool. Well, thank you both for joining us. It's been really fun. For our viewers, if you want to continue to watch cool debates like this, like our page at A Debate Show Without an Interesting Name, and obviously we have a bunch of other shows on Atheist Analysis, so go ahead and like that too. And I am, by the way, very sorry to Daniel Shalit, and you know why. And I love you. Thank you for the show. Peace.